Well, even as a teenager, this young Macedonian demonstrated superior abilities to command and to lead. And while leadership was modeled by his father, Philip, his father died at the age of 20, and the keys to this Macedonian kingdom were given to him. And over the next 12 years, essentially, this young man would conquer the world. His name, Alexander, often referenced as Alexander the Great. He first took the Greek mainland, and then he later faced his most daunting opponent, the Persian King Darius III. And the Persian kingdom was a mammoth kingdom of epic proportions, and they had dominated the world for some 200 years. And it said that 1 million Persians met Alexander on the fields of battle in 331 BC. Alexander, however, would prevail over Darius. Then he'd move towards India, and he'd overpower King Porus of India. And essentially, he would conquer the world. And in fact, it was reported, it was said and written in history books that Alexander the Great wept when there were no more kingdoms to conquer. And after 12 days of high fever, he died at the age of 32 years of age. Well, before Alexander, world civilizations were dominated by Eastern cultures, by the Persians, by the Egyptians, and by the Babylonians. However, Alexander shifted the spotlight to the West, and the underpinnings of culture established by Greek culture and then eventually by the Romans as well. He built new cities, he built ports, and Greek civilization would affect the way world would function, the way trade would operate. And in terms of economic activities, the economic structure and systems that were put in place by Alexander really affected the world, or at least the Western world, until the Industrial Revolution. Greek thinking, Greek civilization, Greek culture would shape the world for centuries. And we know that entire cultures and entire societies are catalyzed by individuals and are facilitated by the networks and the institutions over which they have influence. Such was the influence of one person shaping values, creating systems, defining culture. And we can think of a lot of notable, significant world-shaping individuals, whether it's the Caesars of Rome, whether it's Muhammad in founding Islam, whether it's Martin Luther in launching the Reformation, whether it's political thinkers like Thomas Jefferson or Karl Marx, whether it's modern influencers like Martin Luther King or Margaret Thatcher, or whether it's philosophers, thinkers, and scientists such as Plato, Confucius, Galileo, Darwin, Einstein, or whether it was artists like Michelangelo or Rembrandt or Van Gogh or Beethoven or Handel or Elvis or the Beatles. Did I just put Handel and Elvis in the same sentence? These were shapers of culture, catalyzing change to the entirety of culture. And so entire cultures and societies are shaped by people, by individuals, and then by the networks and systems and institutions over which they had influence. Now, this is Canada Day, and I hope you are filled with gratitude for living in this country. Though undeserving, we are the recipients of incredible blessing, of incredible prosperity, of incredible freedoms, and I hope and pray that we never take for granted the opportunity and the realities that you and I experience. And so whether it's the freedom of worship, freedom of speech, whether it's the prosperity that we enjoy, whether it's the rule of law and justice, I hope that we all share in a common sense of deep gratitude. Yes, as acknowledged, we have our imperfections, but nevertheless we need to be full of gratitude. Now, we also know that although we're to be grateful, we also want to have a sense of morale, a sense of cultural pride. And I hope we have that as well, a sense of pride of our Canadian identity. And I hope, too, that's an appropriate kind of pride. But before we are Canadians, we are Christians. And we never should lose sight of that reality, that we are first Christians And then we find ourselves living in a Canadian culture, in a Canadian context, for which we're immensely, profoundly grateful. And Canadian Christians differ from Chinese Christians. And Canadian Christians differ from American Christians. And Canadian Christians will differ from Jordanian Christians. And Canadian Christians will differ from Russian Christians. And what makes us different is not our Christianity, but our culture, our cultural context, and how culture has impacted us, how it has filtered us, and how we have filtered it, and how it has shaped the way we function and operate as Christians in the given societal or cultural context that we find ourselves. And so what I want to do this morning, with a spirit of immense gratitude, I want us to think about culture. And I want us to think thoughtfully. And I want us to think critically, not as in negatively, but analytically. And I want us to think soberly and somberly with how culture has impacted us. And so the question for this morning as we continue on our You Asked For It series, and this question was not afforded exactly in this way, but here's a wrestling that we all have. How do we view culture? Is culture a friend or foe? Is culture a gift or is it a curse? Is culture something to give into or something that we're called to transform? And so today, let's with a spirit of gratitude, but also thoughtfulness and a critical mind, let's become stewards of culture. And let's try to understand how we are to relate to culture. So how should we view culture? How should we view culture? Well, culture is essentially the beliefs, the values, the behaviors, and the tastes of any given group of people. So there's Canadian culture. And then within Canadian culture, there's all sorts of ethnic pockets of culture. Institutions of all kinds have cultures. In fact, Compass Point has a culture. And when Brant Bible Church and Park Bible Church came together, there was two different cultures at work. And so cultures are there. They're things which define a particular group of people. Now, culture can be a friend. It can be a good thing. And so when we consider the value of progress, I think in most cases progress has been a gift. Our values, our beliefs, our tastes, political stability, freedom, creative expression in the arts, through music and through the fine arts, of course. Of course, there's some very fine, unique Canadian cultural aspects, and whether it's hockey and Tim Hortons, culture can be good. It can be a friend. It can be a gift to us. But culture can also be amoral. In other words, it can be neutral. And so a lot of foods which are not necessarily good for us or bad for us, but they just are part of culture. Language, again, is a neutral, amoral kind. It's a vehicle for communication, and that often defines culture. In fact, language is a very key component to defining culture, but it is amoral in its functioning. And so, ethnic diversity. There's all kinds of amoral qualities about culture, but then culture can be negative. It can be immoral, at least from a Christian lens, from a Christian perspective. And when we consider the impact that relativism, that philosophical relativism has had on us, we can see how it has shaped and impacted culture. And so whether it's in our moral decline, our incredible obsession with sexual freedom, whether it's widespread acceptance of pornography, whether it's racism, whether it's inequality, whether it's tolerance, whether it's selfishness, whether it's our financial irresponsibility measured by our incredible sense of indebtedness and involvement in debt and our inability to manage ourselves financially, whether it's our spirit of entitlement. These are some of the less savory, the less attractive parts of culture, which are a part of who we are, part of the context that we find ourselves living in, but these aren't friends. These are things that they are reality, and they are things that we need to grapple with literally on a daily basis. And it's to those kinds of concerns that the book of Romans speaks sternly, warning us in Romans 12 where it says, verse 2, "Do not be conformed to this world. Do not be shaped by this world. Do not be squeezed by this world. Do not be manipulated by this world, by this system, by this cultural context. But, by way of contrast, dramatic contrast, significant contrast, but, the scriptures say, be transformed by the renewal of your mind. And this has in view the idea of metamorphosis, a transformation of thought process, of values, of systems, of mental models, and of worldview. Don't be conformed by the context you find yourselves living in. Rather, be transformed by what? In your mind, by truth. Be transformed by the renewal of your mind, that by testing you may discern what is the will of God, what is good and acceptable and perfect. And that's why here at Compass Point, and when we merged together a number of years ago, we very intentionally kept the word Bible Church in it, because we just do not want to lose sight of the fact that the underpinnings of our sense of grasping truth and authority are the Bible. And so when you come up the stairs or you come into the lobby, you'll see above the lobby, our first value there is that we cherish biblical truth. We cherish the authority of the Bible in our lives because it has the power, the living power to transform, to metamorphose, to change the way we think. And if our thinking has changed, our behavior will change, our choices will change, everything will change. So the caution for us is to not be conformed by the world in which we live, but to be transformed by our thinking, which in turn changes the way we live and the way we function. So don't be shaped by it. Don't swallow it. Keep your wits about you. Let biblical truth shape the way you think, shape your values, and shape your behaviors. So, culture, when we see the dark side, don't be conformed by it. There's the amoral side, which simply is, and then there's the good part. Now, as Christians, we are called to have an impact upon the culture that we find ourselves living in. Culture can be a realm to shape for the good. Consider Israel. When they were going into the promised land, essentially God said, I want you to create and to build and to be the social architects of a whole new culture where I will be your God. And I will reveal myself and my truths to you. And so they were given the freedom to be the social architects of a whole new society, a whole new culture. Now, H. Richard Niebuhr, in his classic work, Christ and Culture, he identifies throughout history, throughout Christian history, 5 different approaches to culture. Let me just list these really briefly. If you want to do more investigation on this, I'll let you do that on your own. But one model is Christ against culture. And so here you have 2 opposing worldviews in conflict. Which one will win, Christ or culture? And they're always clashing. A second model is that it's Christ of culture, where Christ becomes the culmination of the best of culture. And during the Renaissance, that was sort of the worldview, the mindset, or the relationship with culture, that the Renaissance was the best of culture, and that was the best of Christ. Third view, Christ above culture, where culture might lead us to Christ, but Christ is still above culture. And then there's, I think, really the kind of world we live in today, Christ and culture in paradox. They both coexist in a kind of ongoing tension. So there's Christ, there's culture, and there's ongoing tension between the two. And we vacillate and we live and we get bounced around like a pinball between these two value systems. The fifth model that Niebuhr identifies and suggests is the most biblical one is Christ, transformer of culture. Christ, where we're called to shape culture to reflect the righteousness of God. Now, we won't do that perfectly. It's a broken world, but we're called to have an impact in the world. In fact, the reality is, one of our callings as a Christian people is to be transformers of culture. Biblically, we are commanded to change the world. Going back to the Garden of Eden, Adam and Eve were commanded to cultivate and to preserve the world, to work it, to nurture it, to sustain it, to protect it. We're called to rule and have dominion over the world, to steward it, to care for it. And now in its broken state, to be engaged in a transformation and a redemptive process of it. And so whether it's art or music or literature or commerce or law or science or scholarship, and all of our institutions, all of our relationships, whether it's the family, whether it's the community, whether it's our churches, whether it's the academy, whatever the context, whatever the institution, we can view these as as environments and arenas of transformation and redemption. We want to bring improvement. We want to bring some betterment. We want to be salt and light, and we want to allow those institutions to reflect the righteousness of God any way we possibly can. And this is our calling, to engage the world. Now, allow me to identify some ways in which, over the centuries, the Christian church has profoundly shaped culture. Profoundly so. And so here, Christianity has been immensely influential in the elevation of the sanctity of human life. Whether it's ancient infanticide, or euthanasia, or abortion, where the church has come, where Christianity has come, it has elevated the view of life, the sanctity of an individual's life. And so the disabled, and the weak, and the poor, and the disenfranchised, there's an elevation of the value of that one person's life. And that is in significant part because of a Christian worldview and the value, as we talked about last week, that human beings are made in the image of God and have dignity and value. And so Christianity has been immensely influential in the elevation of sexual morality and the sanctity of marriage. Marriage matters. Marriage is a pivotal underpinning to the building of solid, significant, healthy societies. Christianity has been incredibly influential in the elevation of the freedom and dignity of women. Where the church has come, where Christianity has come, women have been elevated in their roles. Christianity has had an influence in the promotion and the expression of charity and compassion, in the development of hospitals and healthcare, in the development of education at all levels, in the elevation of economic freedoms and the elimination of labor abuses, in the promotion of scientific inquiry, in the promotion of liberty and justice for all, in the abolition of slavery, and in the impact of art, architecture, music, and literature. And I'm not so much intending this to be a list, but just sort of an acknowledgement that throughout the centuries, the church has been profoundly impactful in shaping culture. However, in the last century or so, or even longer, that level of cultural influence has been diminished and diminishing. And so, how can we influence culture today? How can we influence culture in our present historical setting and context? The general view of culture and cultural change is that Christians have failed to change the culture, at least in the last 1 or 2 centuries. And in large measure, it's been accused because we don't have a good understanding of what our own biblical worldview is, or that we haven't tried hard enough. But in reality, it may also be related to the fact that we don't understand how culture works properly or fully enough. And so I want to share with you some things that'll tease your thinking and test your thinking and press your thinking this morning. Sociologist James Davison Hunter, director of the Institute of Advanced Studies of Culture at the University of Virginia, he talks about how healthy cultures nourish life and how decadent cultures destroy life. But he identifies that in the early part of the last century, in the early 1900s, Christianity, or Christians, thoughtful Christians, could very quickly see that the West, which was once reflective of Christendom, the West and Christendom were synonymous prior to that for 1,500 years. That in the early 1900s, there was an increasing separation between what the West represented and Christendom in its foundations, in its roots. There was an increasing separation. And so almost like reflux, what the church did was 3 things. They turned up the volume on evangelism, thinking, of course, that when you change a life, you change a person, you hopefully change a family, change a community, and that you begin to change from the inside out, and you begin to change culture from the bottom up. Then, of course, there was the area of politics. Bad culture comes from bad laws, bad judges, bad politicians. Let's move into the political realm with righteousness, with thoughtful, moral believers, and bring about political transformation. And then thirdly, through volunteer social reform movements, like of course, the temperance movement of the past century, or perhaps more common expressions of volunteer social reform movements would be things like teen abstinence, or just say no to drugs, or the fatherhood movement and Promise Keepers, institutions. They're volunteer social movements to try to bring about cultural change. And so For the last century, we've been turning up the volume on activism through evangelism, through politics, political engagement, and through these volunteer social movements, and have seen some level of impact. And certainly, all of these are good and valuable and worthy and meaningful and significant things to engage in, especially evangelism. That's what we're called to. We're called to make disciples. We're called to change lives. And that's a responsibility that every one of us have on us. However, not all of these initiatives have led to the cultural change that we hoped they would. Colson talks about this in his model, in his book, How Now Shall We Live? And he talks about how big ideas form minds, fire imaginations, move hearts, shape cultures. And his whole thesis is that we find ourselves living in a postmodern culture which has been largely impacted by Darwinian thinking, evolutionary, humanistic, naturalistic, and without God. And that has had all kinds of dark, negative implications on our relativistic postmodern world. And so Colson's model has been, we need to change culture from the inside out, from the bottom up. And again, there has been some movement, some value, some progress made through these three vehicles: evangelism, changing political contexts and landscapes, and through volunteer social reform movements. However, it's not enough. It's not accomplishing the intended effect. It's not working sufficiently. Our strategy is somehow insufficient. And so over the last 2 centuries, we have seen the increasing power of secularism and humanistic naturalism upon culture. And the Christian voice and the Christian worldview having a diminished sense of presence and impact. What's going on? Well, Hunter, this sociologist Hunter, suggests that the missing component is seeing culture as being made up of institutions and of, we're not going to like this word, elites. So Hunter's whole premise is that we need to intentionally enter the elite strategically enter these elite institutions of culture and society. We need some thoughtfulness, and we need some calculation, and we need to get the best and the brightest to enter some of these elite institutions of influence. Let me illustrate this. Hollywood has known for years that G-rated movies can make a lot of money. But you know what the Hollywood elites like to crank out? Elite R-rated flicks. Because there's elite status in these kinds of fringe, pushing the envelopes kinds of values. You see, elites don't count heads, they count status. And elite status is cultural capital. And they know a movie that's going to push the boundaries of pornography or push the boundaries of violence is going to give them increased elite status. It may not make as much money as a G or a PG movie, but it will elevate their sense of status. Another example, the majority of Canadians and Americans are opposed to gay marriage. But it's not some people of those kinds of value systems who are at the center of these decision-making processes. They're not the center of these institutions. They're more in the peripheral of legal and political institutions. Christian novelists outsell all kinds of these postmodern authors and fictional writers. But they will not be acknowledged on the New York Times book list, or in the Globe and Mail, because there is no status attached to those roles. Conservative evangelicals, conservative Catholics are doing a work in their institutions, but so often the leaders of these institutions are those of a more liberal persuasion. I'm not trying to be political here. I'm just trying to acknowledge those that are in the positions of influence culturally. And they may not have quantity, but they have status. And thus they have influence. And so this is what Hunter says. To take charge of the world is to take power seriously. It's to take seriously raising leaders, building networks, and taking over institutions. Now, He says we need to do that without the unbiblical elitism, but he says that's what we need to do. And so as I was ruminating and musing and thinking about this, I thought, look at the examples in Scripture. Let me give you a bunch, okay? Think of Joseph, extracted from his family, taken to Egypt, and raised where? In the capital of Egypt, in the towers of power and positions of influence in Pharaoh's courts, so that he eventually is elevated to a position of enormous influence that he is allowed then to be instrumental in rescuing his own people decades later. Moses, his life was preserved because his mother put him in a little basket in the water. And where does he end up? Again, in the courts of Pharaoh. And he's raised in the courts of Pharaoh, and he understands how power works. He understands how leadership works. He understands how influence works. And though he has his wilderness experience, and though he has his desert experience, he is used by God to interact with and to go toe-to-toe and to confront the leaders of the day, and to in turn lead his people through 40 years of wilderness wanderings to ultimately establish the beginnings of a new society. Think of the early judges and how God is interacting with these political, military, spiritual leaders. Think of the books of Kings, 1st and 2nd Kings, 1st and 2nd Chronicles. They're all describing God's relationship with the highest powers of the land. We look at the story of Daniel. Daniel, again, like Joseph, is extracted out of his home, out of his homeland, and he's taken in exile to Babylon, where he is fed the king's food, and he's immersed in the emperor's education. And the intention is to have him think like a Babylonian, but in the end, God uses him in a position of influence, cultural influence, with cultural capital, to become an agent of salt and light in a desperately pagan context here in Babylon. And then, when the Babylonian Empire falls, God continues to use him because of this position of influence to influence the Medes and the Persians. And so story after story, think even of the early church. Jesus grooms a group of disciples from the peripheries of society and Jewish culture. But when God launches an initiative to reach the Gentiles, who does he use? A brilliant, well-educated man by the name of Paul, who knew how to navigate leadership and cultural influence. And so while some of this might disturb us a little, the Bible is full of stories where God positioned and used key leaders who would catalyze influence and institutions for the advancement of God's kingdom purposes. And so leadership is important, but the ideas of history shaking, like Nietzsche or even Luther for that example, had institutions then who would carry them. And when you have cultural capital, when you have cultural status, you have the power to name things. Like, what does equality mean? What does tolerance mean? What does political correctness mean? We don't have the power to be naming those things, but the cultural elites do. And so, what I'm trying to push us this morning is to think more thoughtfully about how we engage in cultural relationship and how we engage in cultural transformation. There is, without question, a sense in which some very meaningful, significant change takes place from grassroots up. Change your heart, change your family, change your community, change your world. But there's also all kinds of biblical examples where change takes place from the top down. Randall Collins, in his analysis, estimates that there are only 500 people who really have been the catalytic intellectuals to shape 3,000 years of history. 500 people shaped 3,000 years of history. And so what's the mandate for us today? And here's what I want to challenge, especially our young people, that we take seriously our call to evangelism, that we take seriously entering political realms to be agents of salt and light, to put into place good laws and to establish the righteousness of God, to take seriously volunteer social reform movements, the Just Say No to Drugs, the abstinence movement, but also that we intentionally motivate, commission, and challenge some of our young people to enter into some of these elite levels and institutions of society. And so whether it's people like Jonathan Wolff, who's interested in politics, Or whether it's people like who come out of our church, Mike Jansen or Jacob Moon, who are penetrating and working in the music culture. Or whether it's people like Michael Boyd, who's going into law. Or it's others of you who are medicine, journalism, the academy, academic institutions. That we enter these realms with intentionality to become an influencer, to become a leader from the top down, as well as from the bottom up. We live in a wonderful nation, and we should be grateful for it, truly so. I hope you've sensed that today. But we also live in a nation with which we are given a stewardship. Don't conform to the world. Don't buy it, but don't run from it either. Let's view it as an arena of redemption and transformation. And let's seek to enter it, penetrate it from the bottom up and from the top down, and make the culture that we live in the best culture we possibly can. Father in heaven, would you grant that we would take seriously our call as agents of change in our world? Thank you for Canada. But forgive us for our passivity. Forgive us for our naivety. And would you give us the wisdom and insight and courage to be change agents from the bottom up, which we can all engage in, and from the top down, which some of us here in this room are being called to. Would you put a fire in our belly and a passion in our heart to serve you in all of these contexts of life? For this we pray in the name of Jesus. Amen.